Hello, English learners. Welcome back to another exciting episode of our podcast. I'm Adam, your host for all things language and learning.
And I'm Sophia. If you're here, it's probably because you're passionate about improving your vocabulary. But let's face it, learning new words can sometimes feel overwhelming or even frustrating.
Exactly. Many people set out to build their vocabulary with the best intentions, but end up stuck because of common mistakes that slow down their progress or make them give up altogether.
So today, we're going to dive deep into those mistakes, why they happen, how they hold you back, and, most importantly, practical tips to overcome them. Whether you're studying for exams, improving your professional communication, or just expanding your word bank for personal growth, this episode has got you covered.
Stick with us as we share real-life examples, fun strategies, and the best tools to make vocabulary learning not just effective, but also enjoyable. Let's start with one of the most common and frustrating mistakes people make when learning vocabulary: relying on rote memorization without any context. Sophia, I'm sure this sounds familiar to many of our listeners.
Absolutely, Adam. It's probably the first method most of us try when we're learning new words. We make a list of random words, repeat them over and over, and hope they'll stick in our memory. But here's the thing: it rarely works. Sure, you might remember the words for a day or two, but they often fade away because you're not engaging with them meaningfully.
Exactly. Think about it. Have you ever memorized a word, only to completely forget it when you actually needed to use it in a sentence? That's the downside of rote memorization. It doesn't help you understand how or when to use a word. For example, let's take the word serendipity. You can memorize its meaning, a fortunate discovery by chance, but unless you've seen it in a real sentence, it's hard to recall or use it naturally.
That's such a great example. And the truth is, language is all about context. Words aren't isolated. They're connected to situations, emotions, and other words. When you memorize without understanding the context, you're missing out on all those connections. It's like trying to build a puzzle without looking at the picture on the box.
So, Sophia, what's the solution? How can we make vocabulary learning more effective?
The key is to learn words in context. Instead of just memorizing the definition of a word, try to see how it's used in sentences, stories, or conversations. For example, let's go back to serendipity. You might read a sentence like, "It was pure serendipity that I met my old friend at the airport." Now, you're not just learning the word, you're seeing it in action. You understand that it's often used in positive or surprising situations.
That's such a powerful tip. Context doesn't just help you remember the word, it also teaches you how to use it naturally. I've noticed this myself when I'm reading. If I come across a new word, I always try to guess its meaning based on the surrounding words and then look it up. That guessing process actually helps the word stick in my memory.
Exactly. And this is where reading becomes a fantastic tool for vocabulary building. When you read novels, articles, or even blogs, you're exposing yourself to words in their natural environments. You're not just seeing their definitions, you're seeing their tone, their usage, and even their emotional impact.
But what about people who aren't big readers? How can they learn words in context without having to pick up a novel every day?
Great question. If you're not into reading, you can still expose yourself to context through other means. Watching movies, listening to podcasts, or even following YouTube channels in English can be incredibly helpful. For example, if you hear the word meticulous in a movie line like, "She's very meticulous about her work," you're not only learning the word, you're understanding that it means being careful and paying attention to detail.
I love that. And another great tip is to use apps or websites that provide contextual examples. For instance, tools like vocabulary.com don't just give you the definition, they show you the word used in sentences. Or you can use language learning apps like Memrise or Duolingo, which often teach vocabulary through scenarios rather than isolated lists.
Yes. And let's not forget about flashcards. They're a classic tool, but they can be made more effective if you include example sentences on them instead of just the word and its meaning. For instance, on one side, you write meticulous, And on the other side, you write, "She's very meticulous about her work." That way, you're reinforcing the context every time you review.
That's a great point. And here's another thing to keep in mind. When you learn words in context, you're also less likely to misuse them. I've seen people try to sound smart by using fancy words, but because they don't fully understand the context, it ends up sounding awkward or wrong.
Exactly. Context isn't just about memory, it's about mastery. When you truly understand a word, you can use it confidently and correctly. So, if you're listening to this and you've been stuck in the rote memorization trap, don't worry. It's an easy habit to change.
Let's quickly recap this segment. The mistake is relying on rote memorization without context. The solution? Always learn words in context by reading, listening, and seeing them in real-life usage. Use tools that provide examples, and don't be afraid to get creative with flashcards or sentences.
Absolutely. Remember, language is a living, breathing thing. The more you immerse yourself in it, the more naturally it will come to you.
All right, let's dive into the next big mistake that many people make when learning vocabulary, trying to learn too many words at once. This is a trap that's easy to fall into, especially when you're eager to improve quickly. But Sophia, why does this approach backfire so often?
That's a great question, Adam. The main problem with overloading yourself is that our brains can only handle so much information at a time. When you try to cram 50 or 100 words in one sitting, it becomes overwhelming. Instead of mastering those words, you end up forgetting most of them, and it can feel discouraging.
Exactly. It's like trying to fill a bucket with too much water at once. It overflows, and most of it is wasted. Plus, when you're learning too many words at once, you often don't give yourself enough time to really understand their meanings, pronunciation, or usage in context.
Yes, and this often leads to what I call surface learning. You might remember the words for a day or two, but they won't stick in your long-term memory because you haven't engaged with them deeply enough.
So, what's the solution? How can people learn vocabulary more effectively without overloading themselves?
The key is to focus on quality over quantity. Instead of trying to learn 50 words in one day, aim for 5 to 10 words. Spend time understanding each word fully. Its definition, how it's pronounced, how it's used in sentences, and even its synonyms and antonyms. It's better to know a small number of words really well than to half know a large number of words.
That's so true. And I think this is where the concept of spaced repetition comes in. For our listeners who aren't familiar with it, spaced repetition is a technique where you review information at increasing intervals over time. It's scientifically proven to help with memory retention.
Exactly. For example, if you learn a new word today, review it tomorrow, then again after 3 days, a week, and so on. This reinforces the word in your memory without overloading your brain. There are apps like Anki and Memrise that are built around this principle, and they're incredibly effective.
I've used spaced repetition myself, and it's amazing how much it helps. But I also think it's important to review words in different ways. For example, if you're learning the word ambitious, don't just memorize its definition. Try using it in a sentence like, "She's very ambitious about her career goals." Then, a few days later, challenge yourself to come up with your own sentence without looking at the definition.
That's a fantastic strategy. Another way to avoid overloading is to group similar words together. For instance, if you're learning the word happy, you can also learn its synonyms like joyful, cheerful, and content. This not only expands your vocabulary, but also helps you see how these words are slightly different in meaning or usage.
That's such a great tip. Grouping words by themes or categories can also help. For example, if you're learning words related to weather, you might focus on sunny, cloudy, drizzle, and humid in one session. It's more manageable and helps you build connections between words.
And speaking of connections, don't forget to revisit old words while learning new ones. Many people make the mistake of moving on too quickly and neglecting review. Even if you're learning just 5 to 10 words a day, if you don't go back and practice them, they'll fade from your memory.
That's such a good point. It's not about how many words you can learn in a day, It's about how many you can remember and actually use over time. I'd also add that patience is key. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. You're building a skill that will last a lifetime, so it's okay to take it slow.
Absolutely. And I think one more thing to mention is the emotional side of this mistake. When people overload themselves and then forget most of what they've learned, they often feel discouraged or think they're not good at learning languages. But the truth is, it's not about ability, it's about strategy.
That's so important to remember. If you're listening to this and you've been overloading yourself with too many words, don't be hard on yourself. Just adjust your approach. Start small, focus on meaningful learning, and be consistent.
Let's recap this segment. The mistake is trying to learn too many words at once, which leads to burnout and forgetfulness. The solution is to focus on learning fewer words deeply, use spaced repetition for reviews, group similar words together, and revisit old vocabulary regularly. And most importantly, be patient with yourself.
All right, let's move on to the next big mistake people make when building their vocabulary, ignoring pronunciation and spelling. This one might seem minor at first, but it can actually have a huge impact on how effectively you use your new vocabulary. Sophia, have you noticed how often learners overlook this part?
Oh, absolutely, Adam. A lot of people focus solely on the meaning of a word and completely skip over how it's pronounced or spelled. But the problem is, if you don't know how to pronounce a word correctly, you might hesitate to use it in conversation, or worse, use it incorrectly and confuse your listener.
Exactly. I've been there myself. I remember when I first came across the word epitome. I pronounced it as epitome instead of epitome, and I didn't realize I was saying it wrong until someone corrected me. It was embarrassing, but also a learning experience.
That's such a relatable example. And you know, pronunciation isn't just about sounding correct. It's about building confidence. If you're unsure how to say a word, you're less likely to use it in conversations, even if you know what it means. That limits your ability to actually practice and reinforce the word.
Good point. And spelling is just as important. In today's world, where so much communication happens through writing, emails, texts, social media, misspelling a word can give the wrong impression. Imagine writing there instead of there in a professional email. It might seem like a small mistake, but it can affect how others perceive your attention to detail.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about homophones, words that sound the same but have different spellings and meanings. For example, compliment versus compliment. If you mix those up, it can change the meaning of your sentence entirely. So, Adam, what can learners do to avoid these pronunciation and spelling pitfalls?
One of the best ways to improve pronunciation is to use technology. There are so many tools available now. For example, you can use online dictionaries like Cambridge or Merriam-Webster, which provide audio clips for word pronunciation. You can also use apps like Forvo, where native speakers record how words are pronounced.
Yes, and another great tip is to watch English videos or listen to podcasts. Pay attention to how native speakers use and pronounce words. For instance, when you hear someone say hyperbole in a podcast, you'll notice it's pronounced hyperbole, not hyperbole. Repeated exposure really helps.
And don't just stop at listening. Practice saying the words yourself. Repeat them out loud until you're confident with the pronunciation. One trick I've found helpful is recording myself saying new words, then comparing it to the correct pronunciation. It might feel awkward at first, but it works.
That's a fantastic idea. As for spelling, one simple but effective method is writing the words out by hand. There's something about the physical act of writing that helps reinforce spelling in your memory. And if you're someone who prefers typing, use tools like Grammarly or Microsoft Word, which highlight misspelled words and suggest corrections.
I agree. And let's not forget about word origins or etymology. Understanding where a word comes from can make its spelling more intuitive. For example, the word psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning soul or mind, and logos, meaning study. When you know this, the silent P makes more sense.
That's such a good point. Another fun way to practice spelling is through games. Apps like Wordscapes or classic games like Scrabble can make learning spellings less tedious and more enjoyable. Even spelling bees, though they might sound old-fashioned, can be a great way to challenge yourself.
And here's another tip. Pay attention to tricky patterns in English. For example, many people confuse words ending in able and ible. Knowing that reliable uses able and incredible uses ible can save you from a lot of guesswork.
Exactly. And when it comes to homophones, context is key. If you're unsure which word to use, think about the sentence as a whole. For instance, compliment means to praise someone, while complement means to complete something. The sentence will usually give you a clue about which one fits.
That's such a helpful strategy. To wrap up this segment, let's summarize. Ignoring pronunciation and spelling might seem like a small mistake, but it can lead to bigger problems like lack of confidence, miscommunication, or even embarrassment. To avoid this, use tools like pronunciation apps, watch native speakers, practice saying words out loud, and pay attention to spelling patterns and rules.
Exactly. And remember, mastering pronunciation and spelling isn't about perfection. It's about progress. Every mistake is an opportunity to learn and improve. So don't shy away from challenging words. Embrace them.
Now let's talk about another critical mistake that can hinder your vocabulary building journey, learning words in isolation. This is something many learners do, often without even realizing it. Sophia, can you explain why this approach is problematic?
Of course, Adam. Learning words in isolation means studying a single word without understanding its connections to other words or how it fits into sentences, conversations, or themes. For example, you might memorize the word intrepid and its meaning, fearless, but if you don't know how to use it in a sentence like, "The intrepid explorer ventured into uncharted territories," the word remains abstract and difficult to apply in real life.
That's so true. I think the lack of context is what makes these isolated words so easy to forget. When you don't see how a word interacts with others, it becomes just another item on a long list, something your brain is likely to discard quickly.
Exactly. And here's another issue. Language is highly interconnected. Words often have synonyms, antonyms, collocations, and idiomatic expressions that are essential to their proper use. If you learn intrepid in isolation, you might not realize it's closely related to words like brave, bold, or adventurous, or that it's often used in specific contexts like exploration or journalism.
That's such an important point. So what's the alternative? How can learners move away from isolated word lists and start building a more connected vocabulary?
The key is to learn words in groups, themes, or phrases. Instead of just focusing on individual words, try studying related words or expressions together. For example, if you're learning intrepid, also look at phrases like intrepid journalist or related words like courageous and dauntless. This not only reinforces the meaning, but also helps you see the nuances between similar words.
I like that idea. Another method I've found helpful is learning collocations, words that commonly go together. For example, you might learn that we say, make a decision, not do a decision, or strong coffee, not powerful coffee. Understanding these natural pairings makes your speech and writing sound more fluent.
That's such a valuable tip. And don't forget about sentences and stories. When you encounter a new word, try to see how it's used in full sentences or short paragraphs. For instance, if you're reading an article about an intrepid adventurer, you'll also see words like journey, exploration, or risk, which gives you a richer understanding of how the word fits into a larger context.
That's a great point. I also think flashcards can be adapted for this purpose. Instead of just writing the word and its definition, you can include an example sentence or even a small story. For example, instead of just writing intrepid, horse, fearless, you could write, the intrepid firefighter rushed into the burning building to save lives. This way, you're creating a mental image that makes the word more memorable.
Exactly. Another great strategy is to use mind maps. Start with one word in the center like travel and then branch out to related words like explore, adventure, journey, and destination. Then connect those to even more words, phrases, or idioms like wanderlust, road trip, or off the beaten path. This visual approach helps you see how words are connected.
I love that idea. And for people who prefer audio or visual learning, listening to podcasts or watching videos on specific topics can be really effective. For example, if you're learning travel-related words, watch a travel vlog. You'll hear words like itinerary, backpacking, and landmark used naturally, which makes them easier to remember and apply.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about practice. Once you've learned a group of related words, try using them together in conversations or writing. For example, you could write a short story about an intrepid traveler who embarked on a daring journey to uncharted territories. Practicing this way not only reinforces the words but also improves your overall language skills.
That's such a practical tip. I'd also add that learning idiomatic expressions or phrases is a great way to avoid isolation. For example, instead of just learning the word storm, learn phrases like weather the storm or storm out. These expressions give you more tools to communicate effectively and make your vocabulary more dynamic.
Exactly. And one more thing. When you learn words in context, you also start to pick up on cultural nuances. For example, the phrase an intrepid journalist might carry a sense of admiration in English-speaking cultures. These subtleties are important for truly mastering a language.
That's a great point. All right, let's sum up this segment. The mistake is learning words in isolation, which makes them harder to remember and use effectively. The solution is to learn words in context, group them by themes or collocations, and practice them through sentences, stories, or conversations. Tools like mind maps, flashcards, and real-life media can make this process more engaging and effective.
Well said, Adam. Language isn't just about words, it's about connections. The more you see how words fit together, the more confident and fluent you'll become.
All right, Sophia. Now it's time to discuss a mistake that nearly every learner has made at some point: neglecting review and revision. This is such a crucial part of vocabulary building, but it's often overlooked. Why do you think that is?
Good question, Adam. I think many people underestimate how memory works. When you first learn a word, it might feel like it's solidly in your mind, but without regular review, that memory fades quickly. It's called the forgetting curve, a concept from psychology that shows how we forget information over time if we don't actively revisit it.
That's a great point. It's not just about learning new words, it's about keeping them in your long-term memory. And I think another reason people neglect review is because they're focused on progress. They want to keep moving forward, learning new words, instead of spending time going back over what they've already learned.
Exactly. But what they don't realize is that without review, they're not really moving forward. They're losing what they've learned and starting over, which is much less efficient in the long run.
So true. Let's talk solutions. How can learners integrate review and revision into their vocabulary practice effectively?
The first step is understanding that review isn't just about repetition. It's about reinforcing connections in your brain. For example, when you revisit a word you learned last week, you're telling your brain, "This is important. Don't forget it." Spaced repetition is one of the most effective ways to do this.
Spaced repetition is a game changer. For those who aren't familiar, it's a technique where you review information at increasing intervals. So instead of cramming the same list of words every day, you might review them 1 day later, then 3 days later, a week later, and so on. Apps like Anki and Quizlet are great for this because they automate the schedule for you.
Yes. And another way to make reviews more engaging is to use multiple formats. For example, one day you might review a word by looking at its definition and usage. Another day, you could test yourself by trying to use it in a sentence. Mixing it up helps keep things fresh and reinforces the word from different angles.
That's a great idea. I also think reviewing words in context is incredibly important. Instead of just looking at a word in isolation, revisit the sentences, stories, or phrases where you first encountered it. For example, if you learned the word meticulous from an article about a chef, go back and reread that section. It helps bring the word to life.
Absolutely. Context is so powerful. Another technique I love is creating personal connections. For instance, if you're learning the word nostalgia, think of a personal memory that makes you nostalgic, like visiting your childhood home. When you link a word to your own experiences, it becomes much harder to forget.
That's such a good point. And speaking of making things personal, one of my favorite review strategies is journaling. You can challenge yourself to write a short paragraph or story using the words you've learned recently. It's a great way to practice active recall and creativity at the same time.
That's such a fun idea. And for people who prefer speaking over writing, try having a conversation with someone or even just talking to yourself. For example, if you're learning travel-related words like itinerary and landmark, describe your dream vacation out loud using those words. It's a great way to reinforce them in a natural way.
Another active strategy is quizzing yourself. You don't even need a fancy setup for this. Just write down words on one side of a flashcard and definitions or example sentences on the other. Test yourself regularly, and if you get something wrong, make a note to review it again soon.
And let's talk about forgetting words because it's going to happen. And that's okay. A lot of people get discouraged when they forget a word they thought they'd learned. But instead of seeing it as a failure, think of it as a normal part of the process. When you review a word you've forgotten, you're actually strengthening your memory of it.
That's such a positive way to look at it. And I think another key is to prioritize. Not all words are equally important, so if you keep forgetting a word you rarely use, don't stress too much about it. Focus on the words that are most relevant to your goals.
Exactly. And there are so many tools out there to make reviewing easier and more fun. In addition to Anki and Quizlet, I'd recommend trying out games like Wordscapes or crossword puzzles, which can help you review vocabulary in an entertaining way. Even simple things like setting your phone's language to English or reading English subtitles can serve as passive review.
Great suggestions. I'd also add that accountability can help. Partner with a friend or join a language group where you regularly quiz each other. It makes the process more interactive and keeps you motivated.
All right, let's sum up. The mistake here is neglecting review and revision, which leads to forgetting words and losing progress. The solution is to integrate regular review into your practice using techniques like spaced repetition, active recall, context-based learning, and personal connections. And don't forget to make it fun and engaging with tools and activities that work for you. Exactly. Reviewing is just as important as learning new words, if not more so. And the more you make it a habit, the more confident you'll become in using your vocabulary effectively.
All right, Sophia, let's dive into our final and perhaps most critical mistake: overlooking real-life application. This is the point where all your vocabulary-building efforts either come together or fall apart. What's your take on why this happens?
Adam, I think the main reason is fear. A lot of learners are afraid of making mistakes, so they hesitate to use new words in conversations or writing. They focus on studying and memorizing, but stop short of actually applying what they've learned. It's like training for a marathon but never stepping out to run.
That's a great analogy. And it's ironic because real-life usage is the best way to truly learn and remember new vocabulary. Words only become second nature when you use them in meaningful ways, whether it's in conversations, emails, or even personal thoughts.
Exactly. And it's not just about using words, it's about engaging with the language in real contexts. Watching videos, reading books, and listening to podcasts are fantastic. But if you're not actively using what you're learning, it's like watching someone else run the marathon for you.
Why real-life application matters.
That's so true. Real-life application does more than reinforce vocabulary. It helps you understand how words function in different contexts. For instance, you might learn the word subtle in a textbook and think it means as light. But in real conversations, you'll see it used in phrases like subtle humor or subtle differences, which adds depth to your understanding.
Yes. Another thing is confidence. The more you use new words, the more comfortable you become. Even if you stumble at first, every attempt builds your fluency and reduces hesitation over time.
So, let's get into practical strategies. How can learners start applying their vocabulary in real life, especially if they're not living in an English-speaking environment?
One of the easiest ways is to talk to yourself. It might sound silly, but narrating your day in English or thinking in English can help you practice new words. For example, if you've just learned the word ambitious, you could think, I'm feeling ambitious today. My goal is to complete 3 tasks before noon. This way, you're integrating the word into your daily life.
That's such a simple but effective technique. And for those who have access to a language partner or tutor, try using new words in your conversations. Even if it feels forced at first, like saying, I'm feeling quite ambitious today, it helps you practice and get feedback on your usage.
Yes, and writing is another powerful tool. Whether it's journaling, writing emails, or even posting on social media, challenge yourself to use new vocabulary. For example, instead of saying I'm happy, you could write, I'm elated. Or instead of it's a small difference, say it's a subtle difference. These small tweaks make a big impact over time.
I love that. And if you enjoy storytelling, try writing short stories or dialogues using new words. For example, create a story about an intrepid traveler who embarks on a meticulous journey through treacherous terrains. It's a fun way to put your vocabulary to work.
And let's not forget about interacting with native or fluent speakers. If you can't do this in person, try online platforms like language exchange apps or forums. Even commenting on YouTube videos or Reddit threads can be a great way to practice writing and see how native speakers use words in informal settings.
That's such a good point. And watching TV shows or movies in English can also help. Try mimicking phrases or sentences you hear. For instance, if a character says, "That's a bold move," pause the video and repeat it. This not only helps with vocabulary, but also with pronunciation and intonation.
Absolutely. Another immersive activity is playing video games or joining online communities where English is the primary language. For example, multiplayer games often require communication, which gives you a chance to use new words in a natural, engaging way.
Now let's address the elephant in the room, the fear of making mistakes. This stops so many people from applying their vocabulary in real life. How can learners overcome this?
The first thing to remember is that mistakes are a natural part of learning. Everyone makes them, even native speakers. Instead of fearing them, think of mistakes as stepping stones. Each one teaches you something new. For example, if you misuse a word and someone corrects you, that moment sticks in your mind and you're less likely to make the same mistake again.
That's a great mindset. I'd also add that most people are understanding and supportive, especially if they know you're learning. When I was learning Spanish, I misused words all the time, but people appreciated the effort and often helped me out. It's the same with English. People respect your willingness to try.
Let's also talk about making real-life application fun. For example, play word games like Scrabble, Taboo, or Pictionary with friends. These games force you to think about how to use words creatively and quickly.
That's a great suggestion. And for those who enjoy challenges, set small goals for yourself. For instance, challenge yourself to use 5 new words in a conversation or write a short essay using 10 new words. These little tasks keep you motivated and focused.
Another fun activity is translating. If you're bilingual, try translating your favorite song lyrics, movie quotes, or even recipes into English using the vocabulary you've learned. It's a great way to think critically about word usage and meanings.
All right, let's wrap up this segment. The mistake here is overlooking real-life application, which prevents learners from truly mastering and retaining their vocabulary. The solution is to actively use new words in your daily life, through speaking, writing, interacting with others, and engaging in immersive activities like watching videos or playing games.
Exactly. Remember, language is a tool meant to be used. The more you engage with it in real contexts, the more natural and confident you'll become. So don't wait. Start applying what you've learned today.
Well said, Sophia. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on common vocabulary mistakes and how to avoid them. We hope this conversation has given you practical tips to take your vocabulary to the next level.
Absolutely. And remember, building a strong vocabulary is a journey, not a destination. Keep learning, practicing, and applying, and you'll see amazing progress over time.
All right, Sophia. Now let's talk about an essential aspect of vocabulary building that many learners overlook: understanding the nuances of words. It's easy to think that once you've learned a word's definition, you're all set. But in reality, many words have subtle differences in meaning or usage that can make all the difference in your fluency. Why do you think this is such a common issue?
That's such a great point, Adam. I think part of the issue is that learners focus too much on the surface-level meaning of a word without diving into its connotations, cultural context, or various shades of meaning. For example, words like happy, joyful, content, and ecstatic all relate to positive emotions, but they're used in different contexts depending on the intensity and type of happiness being expressed.
Exactly. The meaning of a word can vary based on context, and it's often the subtle differences that make a word more precise and effective in communication. Understanding these nuances helps you avoid sounding awkward, or even worse, saying something that doesn't quite match the situation.
Right. And it's not just about synonyms. Sometimes a word might be technically correct but feel out of place. For instance, happy might work fine in casual situations, but ecstatic might feel exaggerated unless you're talking about something like a major life event, so understanding which word to use when makes a huge difference.
So, why is it so crucial to understand these nuances when learning a language?
Well, Adam, the nuance of a word often reflects a cultural or emotional layer that can't be captured through a dictionary definition alone. Take the word home. It's more than just a place where you live. It's a feeling of comfort, safety, and belonging. Understanding these emotional connotations can help you use the word more effectively. Whether you're writing a heartfelt message or talking to a friend.
That's a great point. I've seen learners struggle because they choose words based on their dictionary meanings, but the words don't fit the tone or context of the situation. Like you mentioned before, ecstatic might not fit in every scenario. So understanding when and how to use certain words can drastically improve your language skills.
Now that we know why it's important, let's talk about how to understand these word nuances. First of all, reading is one of the best ways to get a feel for how words are used in different contexts. When you read books, articles, or stories, pay attention to the words authors use to describe people, places, and emotions. Notice how they choose words based on the situation. This will give you a deeper understanding of word nuances.
That's a great tip. For example, if you're reading a novel and the author describes a character as melancholy versus sad, you might notice that melancholy carries a more reflective, bittersweet connotation, while sad is more general. This shows how word choice can influence the mood or tone of a sentence.
Exactly. Another way to understand nuances is by looking at word collocations, phrases that naturally go together. For example, a deep sorrow or a burning passion. By studying these phrases, you can learn the context in which certain words are more commonly used. It's like seeing words in action instead of just in isolation.
That's a great strategy. I'd also recommend listening to native speakers through podcasts, interviews, or TV shows. Pay attention to how they use certain words in conversation. When you hear mournful versus a sad used in a specific context, it'll become clear why one is more appropriate than the other.
Right, and I love how you mentioned listening. Watching movies or listening to conversations can also help you catch subtle emotional cues. For example, the word angry might be used in a heated argument, but a word like frustrated might be used when someone's disappointed or annoyed by a situation.
Let's talk more about connotations and cultural context, because understanding these layers is crucial to using words correctly. Take the word politician, for instance. In some cultures, the word might carry a neutral or even positive connotation, while in others, it might be associated with corruption or dishonesty. The same word can evoke different feelings depending on cultural background and social attitudes.
Exactly. And it's not just about the word itself, but also about the speaker and the listener's perception. Words like slim and skinny both refer to a person's body type, but slim is usually seen as a more positive term, while skinny can sometimes carry a more negative connotation.
That's such an important distinction to be aware of. I think many learners don't realize that context, whether cultural, emotional, or social, plays a huge role in how words are received. This is why idiomatic expressions and phrasal verbs are so tricky. You can't always translate them word for word into another language, and they often carry subtle meanings that only come with familiarity.
Yes, and that's where immersion and regular practice come in. The more you engage with native content, the better you'll understand these connotations. For example, in American English, we might say a glass half full to describe an optimistic person, but the same phrase might not have the same impact in another language or culture.
So let's break down some practical tips for understanding word nuances. First, make sure to expose yourself to a wide variety of content: books, podcasts, movies, and even casual conversations. The more diverse your exposure, the better you'll understand how words are used in different contexts.
Absolutely. Another great tip is to use a thesaurus, not just to find synonyms, but to explore the subtle differences in meaning between them. A thesaurus often provides examples of how a word is used in a sentence, and these examples can show you exactly when one word is more appropriate than another.
That's a great tool. And I'd also recommend keeping a word journal where you write down words that you find interesting or confusing. Note their meanings, but also make sure to write down example sentences and situations where you could use them. You could even add synonyms and antonyms, along with the nuances of those words.
I love that idea. And if you're unsure about a word's nuance, don't hesitate to ask a native speaker or look it up in a dictionary that provides detailed examples. Platforms like Word Reference or Cambridge Dictionary give you not only definitions, but also context for how words are used in real-life situations.
So to recap, the mistake here is not fully understanding the nuances of words, which can lead to using them incorrectly or inappropriately. The solution is to engage deeply with the language by reading, listening, and using a variety of tools to explore how words are used in different contexts. Pay attention to connotations, collocations, and cultural contexts to gain a richer understanding of every word you learn.
Exactly. Vocabulary building isn't just about memorizing definitions. It's about understanding how words function in the real world. The more you immerse yourself and practice, the better you'll get at choosing the right word for the right situation.
All right, now, let's tackle a mistake that many learners fall into: avoiding difficult words. It's tempting to stick with words you're comfortable with, but that limits your vocabulary and growth. Sophia, why do you think learners tend to shy away from challenging words?
Great question, Adam. I think it's because using difficult words feels risky. Learners often worry about misusing a word or sounding pretentious. There's this idea that easier is better, and if you don't know how to use a complex word perfectly, it's safer to avoid it altogether.
That's so true, but avoiding tough words means you miss out on expanding your vocabulary and improving your language skills. The reality is, struggling with a word and eventually getting it right is a huge part of the learning process. What are your thoughts on why it's important to push through this fear?
Well, Adam, when you avoid difficult words, you end up limiting your expression. You're not able to convey exactly what you mean, and the richness of the language gets lost. English, or any language, is built on nuance and variation. Being able to use precise, challenging words makes you a more effective communicator. Plus, learning new words is part of the fun.
Exactly. And the more you face challenging words, the more confident you'll become. Let's explore this further. Why is avoiding difficult words actually a mistake in the language learning process?
The main issue with avoiding difficult words is that it creates a kind of language plateau. You might be able to communicate, but your language skills won't grow beyond a certain point. If you always rely on basic vocabulary, your language will sound repetitive and less interesting. You'll miss out on the variety and depth that come with more advanced vocabulary.
Yes! And it's not just about sounding more sophisticated. The issue is that words often have very specific meanings. When you avoid them, you're not getting the full spectrum of what the language has to offer. For example, if you always use happy but avoid words like elated, content, or overjoyed, you're missing out on the richness of expressing different types of happiness.
Absolutely. And then there's the lack of precision. Imagine you're in a conversation and you need to describe a situation that is particularly bad. If you keep using the word bad over and over, it doesn't convey the severity or the nuance of the situation. Words like atrocious, appalling, or dreadful give your communication more depth and meaning.
So, how can learners start approaching difficult words instead of avoiding them? The first step is to acknowledge that making mistakes is part of the process.
Right. Start by reading or listening to challenging material and paying attention to unfamiliar words. When you come across a word that seems difficult, don't just skip over it. Look it up, understand its meaning, and notice how it's used in context. This helps you break down the word and make it easier to remember.
Exactly. And another tip is to break down complex words. For example, if you're learning a word like incomprehensible, break it into parts: in, not, comprehend, understand, and able to. By understanding the roots and affixes, you can get a better grasp of the word and its meaning.
That's such a good tip. It's like learning to decipher a code. Once you understand how a word is constructed, it becomes less intimidating. And don't just memorize the definition. Try using the word in a sentence. Even if the first few attempts aren't perfect, keep practicing. The more you use it, the more natural it will feel.
Let's talk a bit about the psychological aspect. Why do you think learners are so afraid to use difficult words?
Most learners fear they'll sound silly or that they'll be judged for using a word incorrectly. They also worry about their accent, pronunciation, or whether their word choice fits the context. It's a fear of making mistakes in front of others.
And the funny thing is, everyone makes mistakes, native speakers included. It's part of the process. In fact, when you try to use a challenging word and mess it up, chances are you'll remember it much better the next time you encounter it. The act of speaking or writing it in a sentence helps reinforce the word in your memory.
Exactly. And let's not forget, most people will appreciate the effort. When you use a sophisticated or precise word, even if it's not perfectly used, it shows that you're engaged with the language and making an effort to improve.
So, what's the best way to practice these difficult words? It's easy to say don't avoid them, but how can learners incorporate them into their routine?
One great technique is the word of the week approach. Pick one difficult word each week and focus on using it in different contexts. Try it in conversations, writing, and even in your thoughts. Make it a goal to use the word at least 3 times in different situations throughout the week.
That's a fun challenge. And don't just focus on the definition. Think about the emotional and contextual usage of the word. For example, let's say your word of the week is perplexed. Try to use it when you're confused, but also pay attention to how native speakers use it. Maybe you hear someone say, "I was perplexed by his explanation," or "She looked perplexed when she saw the results." This helps you understand how to use the word appropriately.
Exactly. And another way to practice is to write a short story or journal entry using the new word. By putting it into your own narrative, you'll understand it better and have fun with the language.
Good advice. You can also make flashcards with the word on one side and example sentences on the other. Review these regularly until the word feels more familiar. And don't be afraid to use a difficult word in a conversation. Even if you make a mistake, the point is to get comfortable using it.
So, why should learners embrace difficult words? Because it broadens their vocabulary, improves their language precision, and boosts their confidence. When you stop avoiding tough words, you open up a whole new world of expression.
Exactly. Think about it. Every time you challenge yourself with a new word, you're taking one more step toward becoming fluent. You're not just learning a new word, you're gaining the power to communicate with more nuance and depth.
That's right. And remember, language learning is a journey. If you take the time to understand and use difficult words, you'll discover that they're not as intimidating as they first seemed.
That's a perfect note to end on, Sophia. The more we embrace difficult words, the more we grow as language learners. So let's stop avoiding them and start using them.
To wrap up, avoiding difficult words is a mistake because it limits your ability to express yourself fully. The key is to approach these words with curiosity, break them down, and practice using them in context. With time and practice, these challenging words will become second nature.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to tackle difficult words. Embrace them and use them as tools to become a more confident and articulate communicator. And remember, everyone makes mistakes along the way. What matters is that you keep moving forward.
Thanks for joining us in today's segment. Next time, we'll talk about another crucial aspect of vocabulary learning, choosing the right word for the right context. Until then, keep challenging yourself and expanding your vocabulary.
We've covered a lot of ground today, Sophia. From the pitfalls of rote memorization to the importance of understanding word nuances, it's clear that learning vocabulary is about so much more than just memorizing lists of words. Let's take a moment to summarize the key takeaways for our listeners.
Absolutely, Adam. First, we discussed how relying on rote memorization without understanding context can make words forgettable and difficult to use. To overcome this, learners should focus on connecting new words with examples, stories, and real-life experiences.
Right. Then we moved on to overloading yourself with too many words at once. It's much more effective to learn a few words deeply than to try and cram dozens of words into your memory without really understanding them.
Exactly. And we also talked about ignoring pronunciation and spelling. This is a common mistake that can lead to misunderstandings in communication. Tools like phonetic guides, pronunciation apps, and regular listening practice can help here.
After that, we emphasized the importance of not learning words in isolation. Grouping words by themes or contexts helps create stronger mental associations, making it easier to remember and use them.
And we can't forget neglecting review and revision. Regularly revisiting words through flashcards, spaced repetition apps, or even casual writing and speaking practice ensures that you retain what you learn.
Then we tackled the critical aspect of applying vocabulary in real life. Avoiding this step limits your confidence and prevents the words from becoming an active part of your speech or writing.
We also explored the nuances of words. It's not enough to know the dictionary definition. You need to understand how and when to use a word appropriately to capture its full meaning and impact.
And finally, we talked about avoiding difficult words. Challenging yourself with new and complex vocabulary is a key part of growth. Don't fear mistakes. They're an essential part of the learning journey.
So, Adam, what's the biggest lesson you'd like our listeners to take away from today's discussion?
I think the biggest lesson is that vocabulary building isn't just about quantity, it's about quality. Learning fewer words, but understanding them deeply, practicing their pronunciation, and using them in the right context will take you much further than memorizing long lists without engagement. What about you, Sophia?
For me, it's the idea that learning vocabulary is a dynamic, ongoing process. It's not something you do once and forget about. The more you immerse yourself in reading, listening, speaking, and writing, the more natural it becomes. Consistency and curiosity are key.
Perfectly said. And let's not forget to remind our listeners, language learning is a journey, not a destination. Celebrate small victories, be patient with yourself, and keep pushing forward.
Exactly. And remember, every mistake is a step closer to fluency. Don't be afraid to experiment with new words, ask questions, and seek feedback. That's how you grow.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into vocabulary learning. We hope you found these tips helpful and are inspired to apply them to your own language journey.
Keep practicing, stay consistent, and most importantly, have fun with it. Until next time, happy learning.
Take care, everyone, and we'll see you in the next episode.